Eleanor Fairchild's breath frosted in the mountain air as she stared up at the bearded giant blocking her path to the abandoned mining cabin. "You're too small to survive out here," the mountain man said, his voice gruff as the jagged peaks surrounding them. "Winter's coming, and these hills kill full-grown men twice your size." Eleanor tightened her grip on her father's rifle, meeting his gaze without flinching. "Then I suggest you find shelter, sir, because I intend to outlast both the night and your expectations." Eleanor struggled to close the cabin door against the howling wind as snow rushed in like an uninvited guest, dusting the worn wooden floor with white. Ezra Blackwood, the mountain man who had reluctantly led her to this abandoned mining shelter, secured the door with a heavy wooden bar, his massive frame dwarfing her slender one as they stood in the dimming light. The blizzard had descended faster than either expected, trapping them together in this one-room haven that suddenly felt impossibly small for two strangers with nothing in common but their immediate need for shelter. The cabin was sparse but solid, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall, a narrow bed pushed against another, and a simple table with two mismatched chairs. Wind whistled through gaps in the log walls, creating an eerie melody that underscored the severity of the storm outside. "3 cans of beans and some jerky won't keep you alive up here, miss," Ezra scoffed, watching skeptically as Eleanor unpacked her meager supplies from a pack that seemed too large for her frame. His voice carried the gruff edge of someone unaccustomed to company, particularly female company, and his beard couldn't hide the frown that seemed permanently etched on his weathered face. "You take the bed," he muttered, arranging his own gear near the fireplace. "I'll sleep here." Eleanor thanked him quietly, her soft voice nearly lost in the cabin's creaks and groans as the wind battered against it. As Ezra built a fire, its growing flames illuminated the space between them. Not just physical distance, but the gulf of purpose that separated them. Eleanor methodically arranged her belongings, each movement purposeful despite her obvious exhaustion from the day's climb. When she pulled out a faded photograph of an older man with her same determined eyes, Ezra's gaze lingered longer than he intended. "My father," she explained, catching his look. "John Fairchild. He was prospecting these mountains when his letters stopped coming 3 months ago. The authorities gave up the search after 2 weeks, said the mountains had claimed another victim, but I know he's alive." Eleanor's voice remained steady, even as her fingers trembled slightly against the photograph's worn edges. "I've traced his last known route to this area, and I intend to find him, or at least discover what happened." Ezra's expression shifted almost imperceptibly at the mention of John Fairchild, something Eleanor didn't miss despite the shadows dancing across his face. "You knew him," she said, more statement than question. The mountain man busied himself with the fire, avoiding her penetrating gaze. "These mountains are no place for someone your size, miss," he finally responded, deflecting her observation. "Men twice as big and 3 times as experienced have disappeared without a trace up here. Winter shows no mercy to anyone, especially not to city folk playing at survival." The fire popped loudly in the silence that followed, sparks flying upward as if emphasizing his point. Outside, the blizzard intensified, snow now completely covering the single window, casting the cabin in a strange, muffled isolation that made their forced companionship feel both temporary and timeless. Eleanor wrapped her father's jacket tighter around her shoulders, its oversized dimensions highlighting her small stature, but doing nothing to diminish the determination in her eyes as she stared at the mountain man across the flickering firelight, 2 strangers bound by circumstance and, though Ezra wouldn't admit it yet, by something more. Night fell like a heavy curtain over the mountains, bringing with it a darkness so complete that the cabin windows reflected only the dancing flames within rather than showing the world outside, though the intensifying howl of the blizzard told its own story of nature's growing fury. The temperature dropped sharply, forcing Eleanor and Ezra into an uneasy proximity near the fireplace as they silently shared a meager supper of jerky and beans heated in a dented pot over the flames. The wind found every crack and crevice in the old cabin walls, its moaning punctuated by the sharp cracking of tree branches surrendering to the weight of ice and snow outside. Eleanor wrapped her thin blanket tighter around her shoulders, trying to hide the shivers that occasionally ran through her small frame, but nothing escaped Ezra's watchful gaze as he methodically fed branches into the hungry fire. The first drop of water hit the wooden floor with a soft pat that somehow cut through the storm's cacophony, drawing both their attention upward to where a dark stain was spreading across the ceiling beams. Before Ezra could rise from his position, 3 more drops fell in quick succession, followed by a trickle that began at the far corner where the roof met the wall. "Worst storm I have seen in 7 years," Ezra muttered, his voice barely audible above the wind as he grabbed an empty pot and positioned it under the most active leak. Eleanor was already moving, her earlier exhaustion seemingly forgotten as she pulled containers from her pack and placed them strategically around the cabin floor where water was beginning to seep through multiple weak points in the roof. Ezra watched with growing concern as the leaks multiplied faster than their containers could catch them, the cabin groaning under the assault of wind and accumulating snow. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, threatening to soak their supplies and extinguish the precious fire that stood between them and the deadly cold. Without speaking, Eleanor upended her pack onto the bed, revealing an oilskin tarp folded among her possessions. With quick, efficient movements that belied her size, she climbed onto the small table, pushing against the ceiling with the tarp to create channels that directed the water flow away from the fire and their sleeping areas. Not waiting for Ezra's help or approval, she then took a small tin of beeswax from her supplies and began sealing the worst gaps where wind drove snow through the wall joints, using her nimble fingers to reach spaces that Ezra's larger hands could never have managed. "Smart thinking, though it won't matter if the whole roof caves," he remarked, his gruff voice carrying a note of genuine admiration that he seemed unable to suppress completely. Eleanor did not pause in her work, but the firelight caught the brief smile that flickered across her face at his reluctant praise. She worked methodically through exhaustion, her small body stretching and contorting to reach problem areas, occasionally standing on Ezra's reluctantly offered shoulders to access the highest points of the cabin. The mountain man found himself holding his breath more than once as she balanced precariously, her weight so slight on his broad shoulders that he could almost forget she was there until her voice directed him to move slightly left or right. The storm raged on with increasing violence, yet inside the cabin a fragile security formed through their combined efforts, the fire protected and their supplies salvaged. When Eleanor finally descended from her last repair, her face in the firelight revealed both fear and resolve, the reality of their situation etched in the shadows under her eyes and the tight set of her jaw. She was exhausted but triumphant, having transformed their shelter from failing refuge to fortress against the elements. Ezra silently handed her a cup of hot coffee from the pot he had kept warm by the fire, their fingers briefly touching in the exchange, and something unspoken passed between them, a mutual acknowledgement that they had survived the first challenge of many this mountain would throw at them before morning light. The ancient grandfather clock in the corner, its mechanism somehow surviving decades of abandonment, wheezed out 12 hollow chimes that barely registered above the storm's constant assault, marking midnight's arrival in this forgotten outpost. Eleanor had finally surrendered to exhaustion, curled beneath her blanket on the bed, while Ezra maintained his vigil by the fire, occasionally rising to check their makeshift drainage system which continued to hold against the relentless leaks. The blizzard had settled into a steady rhythm of howling wind and driving snow, almost lulling in its terrible consistency, when a new sound cut through the familiar cacophony. A long, mournful howl that raised the hair on Ezra's neck and snapped Eleanor immediately awake. "Wolves," Ezra whispered unnecessarily as Eleanor was already on her feet, her blanket discarded as she moved silently to the window where frost patterns had formed intricate designs on the glass. The storm had briefly abated enough for moonlight to break through the clouds, casting an eerie blue glow across the snow-covered landscape and illuminating several dark shapes circling the cabin at a cautious distance. "Hunger drives them down from the high country," Ezra explained, his voice low as he reached for his rifle propped against the wall. "They smell our food and the fire. Trouble is, they're desperate enough to try breaking in." His large hands closed around the weapon, but when he attempted to work the bolt action, it refused to move, frozen solid from the temperature and possibly from snow that had blown into the mechanism during their journey. Ezra cursed under his breath, working the bolt with increasing force until Eleanor quietly held out her hand for the weapon. Skepticism flashed across his face, but desperation won out as another howl, closer this time, echoed through the night, followed by scratching sounds at the cabin's rear wall. Eleanor took the rifle and moved to the fireplace, her movements quick but methodical as she disassembled the weapon with practiced ease, laying the parts on a cloth she spread beside the flames. Her small fingers worked deftly, cleaning ice from the mechanism with a combination of heat and careful scraping, applying a thin coating of oil from a tiny vial she produced from a pocket sewn inside her jacket. "My father taught me," she explained simply, responding to Ezra's unasked question as she reassembled the rifle with the same efficient precision, checking each component before sliding it back into place. The scratching outside intensified, joined by the sound of heavy bodies throwing themselves against the cabin walls as the pack grew bolder. Sensing the humans inside, Ezra took up position by the door with his hunting knife, while Eleanor moved to the window, rifle raised against her shoulder, in a stance that spoke of years of practice rather than theoretical knowledge. The glass suddenly shattered inward as a massive grey wolf launched itself toward the opening, its hungry eyes reflecting the firelight, teeth bared in a snarl that promised death. The rifle crack was deafening in the confined space, the bullet finding its mark with unerring precision through the wolf's open mouth, dropping the creature instantly before it could clear the windowsill. Eleanor worked the bolt smoothly, ejecting the spent casing and chambering another round, without taking her eyes from the window where more shapes moved in the moonlight. Twice more the rifle spoke, each shot precise and deadly, until the remaining wolves retreated, their howls fading into the distance as they decided easier prey might be found elsewhere. The cabin fell quiet except for the crackling fire and their own breathing, the danger passing as suddenly as it had arrived. Ezra stared at Eleanor with new eyes, reassessing everything he had assumed about this small woman who had just saved them both with skills he would have considered impossible for someone of her stature and background. Outside, the storm clouds parted further, allowing moonlight to flood the snow-covered valley, creating an otherworldly landscape of blue shadows and silver highlights that stretched toward distant peaks. The departing wolves' howls echoed hauntingly across the vastness, a reminder of dangers temporarily avoided but not eliminated. "We should board up that window," Eleanor said matter-of-factly, as she carefully unloaded the rifle before leaning it against the wall, her voice steady despite the adrenaline that must have been coursing through her body. Ezra nodded wordlessly, already moving to gather materials, his earlier skepticism about her abilities giving way to something that might, with time, become respect. With the window secured using boards pried from an abandoned storage chest, the immediate danger passed, allowing a fragile calm to settle over the cabin despite the storm's continued presence outside. Ezra added more wood to the fire, building it higher than necessary, the extra warmth a silent acknowledgement of the cold fear they had both experienced during the wolf attack. Eleanor retrieved 2 tin cups from her pack and poured the last of the coffee from the pot kept warm at the edge of the hearth, the rich aroma filling the small space with an almost domestic comfort that belied their precarious situation. She handed 1 cup to Ezra, their fingers briefly touching in the exchange, neither acknowledging the momentary connection nor pulling away too quickly. They sat in silence for several minutes, the crackling fire and occasional cabin creak the only sounds accompanying their thoughts as they sipped the bitter brew, each measuring the other with sideways glances that revealed more curiosity than the suspicion that had marked their earlier interactions. "You handle that rifle better than most men I know," Ezra finally said, his voice rough from disuse and grudging admiration. Eleanor smiled faintly, her eyes reflecting the dancing flames as she stared into the fire. "My father believed a woman alone needs to protect herself, especially one my size. He started teaching me to shoot when I was 8 years old." The statement hung between them, an invitation for further conversation that Ezra hesitated to accept. Visibly struggling with his habitual solitude and the unexpected desire to know more about this surprising woman. "How long have you been up here alone, Ezra Blackwood?" Eleanor asked quietly, breaking the silence before it could grow uncomfortable. Her direct question, using his full name, startled him into answering more honestly than he might have otherwise. 7 years, he replied, his gaze fixed on the fire as if the flames contained memories he both sought and avoided. "After the typhoid took my wife and son, there wasn't much reason to stay in civilization. The mountains don't ask questions or offer sympathy. They just are. And a man can find a kind of peace in that." Eleanor nodded, understanding filling her expression rather than the pity he clearly dreaded. The silence that followed felt less like a barrier and more like a shared respect for losses that words could never adequately address. "My father mentioned a rich gold strike in his last letter." Eleanor volunteered after several minutes had passed, her voice soft but clear in the cabin's stillness. "He wrote that he had found a vein that could make us wealthy enough to rebuild the life we lost after my mother died. But he also mentioned concerns about someone trying to claim it." Ezra shifted uncomfortably, his large frame suddenly seeming too confined in the small space as Eleanor continued. "He wrote about a mountain man who knew these hills better than anyone, someone who had helped him navigate the most dangerous passes but who also knew the value of what he had found." She studied Ezra's face carefully as she spoke, watching for reactions he could not entirely suppress despite years of practiced isolation. The fire popped loudly in the silence that followed her words, sending sparks up the chimney and momentarily illuminating the tension that had crept back into the room, different now than before, complicated by growing mutual respect that conflicted with suspicions neither could fully dismiss. "You think I had something to do with your father's disappearance?" Ezra stated flatly, meeting her gaze directly for the first time since the conversation began. It wasn't a question, and his voice held no anger, only a weariness that spoke of a man accustomed to others' distrust. "I think you know more than you've told me," Eleanor replied evenly, her small hands steady around her coffee cup. "And I think you recognized his name the moment I mentioned it." The cabin suddenly felt smaller, the space between them charged with unspoken questions and half-formed conclusions that neither was ready to voice aloud. Outside, the wind shifted direction, driving snow against the repaired window with renewed force, a reminder of the wilderness that isolated them from the rest of the world and from whatever truths waited beyond this temporary shelter. Ezra opened his mouth to respond, hesitated, then set down his empty cup with a finality that suggested their conversation had reached its limit for now. "Dawn's still hours away," he said, his voice neutral but not unkind. "You should get some rest while you can. The storm isn't done with us yet." Eleanor nodded, recognizing the boundary he had drawn but not conceding the territory of her questions, merely agreeing to postpone their exploration. The firelight played across her determined features as she wrapped herself in her blanket, her eyes remaining on Ezra's troubled face until he turned away, unable to bear the weight of her searching gaze and the secrets he still kept locked within himself. Eleanor woke shivering violently despite the cabin's warmth, her small frame racked with tremors that shook the narrow bed frame against the wall and drew Ezra's immediate attention from where he had been repairing a tear in his coat by the fire. The storm outside had weakened to occasional gusts that rattled the windows, suggesting the worst had passed. But a new crisis was clearly developing inside their shelter as Ezra rushed to Eleanor's side, alarmed by the unnatural flush that coloured her pale cheeks and the glazed look in her normally sharp eyes. "Let me see your arm," he demanded, having noticed how she had favoured her right arm during their work on the cabin. The way she had winced when reaching up to secure the window after the wolf attack, details his experienced eyes had catalogued but not questioned until now. Eleanor resisted weakly, then surrendered as another wave of shivers overtook her, allowing Ezra to push up her sleeve and reveal an angry red gash running from wrist to elbow, the edges puffy and streaked with ominous red lines that stretched toward her shoulder. "When did this happen?" Ezra asked, his voice rough with concern as he gently probed the wound, feeling heat radiating from the infected flesh. "Yesterday morning," Eleanor admitted through chattering teeth, "when I slipped crossing the ravine before we met. I cleaned it as best I could, but I suppose it wasn't enough." Her attempted smile faltered as her eyes rolled back, consciousness slipping away as fever claimed her fully, leaving Ezra with the sudden, terrifying responsibility of a life balanced precariously in his unprepared hands. For a moment, panic gripped him, memories of his wife and son in their final hours threatening to paralyze him with the familiar helplessness of watching loved ones slip away. But he forced those ghosts back with a physical shake of his head, drawing instead on knowledge he had buried along with his family 7 years ago. Military medic training from another lifetime resurfaced as he moved with renewed purpose, retrieving his pack from beside the fireplace and emptying its contents onto the table. Searching for supplies, he had carried more from habit than expectation of use. Pine resin collected during his solitary wanderings, dried yarrow gathered from high meadows during summer months, willow bark saved for his own occasional pain, all laid out beside clean cloths as he built up the fire to heat water in their largest pot. He cleaned the wound carefully, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he washed away dried blood and dirt, noting with relief that while infection had clearly taken hold, the blade or branch that had caused the injury had not penetrated too deeply. Eleanor drifted in and out of consciousness, murmuring occasionally about her father or responding to Ezra's quiet instructions to drink the bitter tea he brewed from willow bark to help reduce her fever. He worked methodically through the night, applying a poultice of pine resin mixed with yarrow to draw out infection, changing it whenever the heat of her body dried the mixture, bathing her forehead with cool cloths made from melted snow, all while maintaining a steady stream of one-sided conversation that seemed meant to anchor them both to the present rather than slipping into their respective painful pasts. "Don't you die on me, little sparrow," he muttered during the darkest hour before dawn, when her fever peaked and her breathing grew shallow, the nickname slipping out unbidden, and surprising him with its tenderness. Too small maybe for these mountains, but too stubborn to let them win. "Aren't you?" His voice cracked slightly on the question, revealing how deeply her plight had penetrated the walls he had built around himself since losing his family. The cabin, which had been merely a shelter of convenience, transformed during those long hours into something approaching a home, with Ezra moving between fireplace and bedside with increasing familiarity, arranging his limited supplies, with the care of someone protecting what mattered rather than merely surviving until morning. When the first grey light of dawn filtered through the frost-covered window, Eleanor's fever finally broke, her skin cooling beneath Ezra's tentative touch as he checked her forehead for what felt like the 100th time. Her eyes fluttered open, clear now though exhausted, focusing on his bearded face with a weak smile that nevertheless contained genuine warmth. "You're still here," she whispered, her voice rough from thirst, but stronger than he had dared hope. Ezra nodded, suddenly self-conscious as he realized how intimately he had cared for this woman who had been a stranger just days before, how completely her well-being had consumed his thoughts and actions through the long night. "Where else would I go?" he responded gruffly, but the hand that helped her sit up to drink the broth he had prepared was gentle, and the relief in his eyes belied his attempt at casual indifference. Eleanor took the cup with trembling hands, her fingers brushing his in silent acknowledgement of all that had passed between them in the night, the barrier of suspicion not gone, but significantly weakened by his care and her vulnerability. "Little sparrow," she repeated thoughtfully, having apparently heard more during her fever than he realized. "I think I prefer that to being too small to survive." They ate the rabbit stew in a silence that grew heavier with each passing moment. Eleanor allowing Ezra to regain his strength with nourishment before confronting him with what she had discovered, the leather journal resting beside her bowl, like a physical manifestation of the questions that hung between them. The cabin had warmed considerably with the fresh supply of wood, but a different kind of tension now filled the space, one that no fire could dispel, as Eleanor finally pushed her empty bowl aside and placed her hand deliberately on the journal, drawing Ezra's wary gaze to it. "You knew my father," she said quietly, her voice neither accusatory nor pleading but carrying a certainty that brooked no denial. "You know what happened to him." It wasn't a question, and they both recognized the moment of reckoning had arrived, inescapable as the winter that held them in its grip. Ezra set down his spoon with a finality that acknowledged the end of pretense, his broad shoulders seeming to carry a new weight as he met Eleanor's steady gaze across the small table that suddenly felt like an unbridgeable divide. "I met John last spring," he began, his deep voice roughened by emotion he clearly struggled to contain. He was different from most prospectors, smart enough to realize he needed a guide who knew these mountains, respectful enough to listen, at least at first. Ezra paused, his eyes drifting to the window where weak afternoon sunlight sparkled on snow-crusted branches outside, as if seeking guidance from the wilderness that had been his only companion for so many years. "I showed him areas others had overlooked, places where the terrain suggested gold deposits might be found if a man knew how to read the signs. And he found it, didn't he?" Eleanor prompted when Ezra's silence stretched too long, her fingers tracing the worn leather cover of the journal that contained detailed descriptions of a vein rich enough to change lives, to rebuild the security her father had sought for them both. Ezra nodded, his expression darkening as memories clearly surfaced. "The richest strike I've seen in 20 years, hidden in a canyon most men would pass right by." John was ecstatic, already planning what it would mean for you, talking about the life you'd have once he staked his claim properly. His hands, large and scarred from years of mountain living, curled into fists on the table as his voice dropped lower. "I warned him about Silas Rowe, told him to keep the discovery quiet until the claim was legally filed. Rowe has killed for far less than what your father found." The name hung in the air between them, carrying a malevolence that seemed to dim the firelight. Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature as she opened the journal to a page she had marked, where her father's normally neat handwriting grew hurried and agitated. "Ezra claims we're being followed. Says it's Rowe and his men. Think he's being overcautious, but agreed to leave most equipment cached here while we scout alternate route to registry office." Her voice faltered slightly as she looked up from the page. "What happened to him, Ezra?" "The truth." Ezra's face contorted with grief and guilt so raw that Eleanor almost regretted her demand. But she held his gaze, needing to know everything after months of uncertainty and false hopes. "Your father didn't listen," he finally said, the words seeming to be physically painful to speak. "Not completely. He agreed to take precautions, but wouldn't abandon the site long enough to file the claim properly. Wanted to extract enough gold first to prove the claim's value. I found him too late. The avalanche that buried the canyon entrance wasn't natural. Rowe and his men triggered it while your father was working the site. I spent 3 days digging, looking for signs, following tracks." Ezra's voice broke, his massive frame seeming to collapse inward with the admission. "I found blood, lots of it, and drag marks leading to where they'd camped. They took him, alive or dead I couldn't tell, but they left these behind." He reached into his shirt and withdrew a leather cord from which hung a small gold locket that Eleanor recognized immediately, her hand flying to her throat where an identical piece had rested until she had given it to her father for luck on his journey. Tears filled her eyes, but didn't fall as she took the locket, opening it to reveal the tiny portrait of herself as a child alongside her mother, the twin to her father's most precious possession. "I've been tracking Ro ever since," Ezra continued, his voice steadying with resolved purpose. "He's careful, moves between territories to avoid attention, but he'll return to these mountains eventually. Men like him always do, drawn back to the scene of their crimes by greed or guilt or some darker need." The cabin felt charged with emotion, the space between them no longer empty but filled with shared grief and purpose that created an unexpected bond. Outside, the clouds broke momentarily, revealing a night sky scattered with stars that cast the snow-covered landscape in stark silver light, the distant peaks standing like silent witnesses to their pact. "What happens now?" Eleanor asked, closing the journal with a gentle reverence that honored both its contents and the man who had written them. Ezra stood, moving to the window to gaze out at the vast, unforgiving beauty that had been both his refuge and his purgatory for 7 long years. "We wait for Ro," he said simply, "and when he comes, we'll be ready." The "we" hung in the air between them, an alliance forged through survival and truth, neither one commenting on how completely their relationship had transformed from reluctant shelter mates to partners united by a common cause. Eleanor joined him at the window, her small frame barely reaching his shoulder. Yet somehow they appeared matched in the reflection on the glass, both carved by loss into something stronger than they had been before. "I won't slow you down," she promised, her voice soft but carrying the same steel that had brought her alone into these mountains against all advice and common sense. Ezra glanced down at her, a hint of his earlier skepticism returning before recognition of her proven worth replaced it. "No, little sparrow," he agreed, his tone holding a warmth that would have been unimaginable days before. "I believe you won't." They had taken turns keeping watch through the night, neither fully trusting that their conversation about Ro wouldn't somehow summon the very danger they discussed, a mountain superstition that Ezra had never been able to shake despite his practical nature. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten with the first hint of dawn, turning the snow-covered peaks from black silhouettes to purple shadows against the gradually brightening horizon when Eleanor, taking the final watch, spotted movement at the edge of the tree line below the cabin. She woke Ezra with a hand pressed gently but urgently against his shoulder. No words needed, as he instantly registered the alertness in her posture and the meaningful glance she directed toward the window. He joined her there, careful to stay hidden behind the rough curtain as he surveyed the approach, his experienced eyes quickly counting 4 men moving with deliberate stealth through the deep snow, their positions suggesting tactical training rather than random approach. "Silas Ro," Ezra confirmed grimly, recognizing the tall figure directing the others with controlled hand signals. Even at this distance, Ro's distinctive gait and the silver pistol handles glinting at his hips were unmistakable. The coincidence of his arrival so soon after Eleanor finding her father's journal struck them both simultaneously, their eyes meeting in shared understanding. "Someone told him she was here," Ezra whispered, already moving to retrieve both rifles from their place by the door. "Either spotted her in town before she left or tracked her from there." Eleanor checked her weapon methodically, her movements calm despite the gravity of their situation. They were prepared for this confrontation, but not so soon, not before they had fully recovered their strength or formulated a proper plan beyond basic survival. "They know we're outnumbered," she whispered, counting the remaining ammunition with a frown. "But they don't know we're expecting them." Ezra nodded, quickly gathering essential supplies into a small pack while maintaining sight lines to the approaching men. 4 against 2, he muttered. The odds grim, but not impossible, given their defensive position and superior knowledge of the cabin's weaknesses and strengths. Before they could discuss strategy further, Ro's voice cut through the crisp morning air, carrying easily across the snow-covered clearing that surrounded the cabin. "I know you're in there, Blackwood," he called, his tone almost conversational despite the obvious threat implied by the armed men spreading out to surround the small structure. "Bring me the girl and the map, and maybe we can all walk away from this with minimal bloodshed." Ezra's face hardened at the casual way Roe referenced Eleanor, as if she were merely a commodity to be traded rather than a person with her own stake in this confrontation. "The rear wall," he whispered urgently to Eleanor, indicating a spot where the logs had partially rotted near the foundation, creating a gap just large enough for someone of her size to squeeze through if the interior boards were removed. "Can you fit through there?" Eleanor was already moving, quickly assessing the opening, and nodding as she gathered her rifle, knife, and a small pouch of ammunition. "I can circle behind them," she whispered, her mind racing through possibilities and risks. "Create a distraction when they focus on you." Ezra hesitated, clearly torn between keeping her safely inside and recognizing the tactical advantage her plan offered. His expression softened briefly as he handed her an extra cartridge box from his own supplies. "Never seen anyone that small move that quiet through snow," he said, his voice rough, with an emotion neither of them had time to examine. "Stay low, use the trees for cover, and if things go badly, head west toward the trading post. Don't wait for me." Eleanor's refusal was immediate and absolute, conveyed with nothing more than a firm shake of her head and a determined set to her jaw that brooked no argument. Before Ezra could press the point, another call from outside demanded their attention. Running out of patience, "Blackwood," Roe shouted, his previous civility giving way to the true menace beneath. "We know about the Fairchild girl. We know she found her daddy's map. Last chance to be reasonable before we burn you both out." Ezra moved to the front window, deliberately showing himself just enough to draw attention, while Eleanor worked quickly to remove the interior boards blocking the gap in the rear wall. "Roe," Ezra called back, keeping his voice steady and controlled. "There's nothing for you here. The claim was buried in the avalanche. You made sure of that." The distraction worked, all eyes turning toward Ezra's voice as Eleanor silently slipped through the narrow opening, her small frame barely disturbing the snow as she emerged on the far side of the cabin and immediately pressed herself flat against the wall. The morning light created long shadows across the pristine white landscape, providing perfect concealment as she began moving stealthily between trees, circling wide to approach the men from behind. Her feet found natural depressions in the snow, her weight distributed carefully to avoid the telltale crunch that would give away her position. Inside, Ezra continued the verbal exchange, each response calculated to hold Roe's attention while revealing nothing of value, a delicate balance between keeping the men focused on the cabin's front and avoiding pushing them to immediate violence. Through the trees, Eleanor could see the man positioned furthest from the group, a sentry watching the eastern approach with a rifle held lazily across his body, his attention divided between his companions and the surrounding forest. His overconfidence made him careless, never thinking to look behind for a threat he couldn't imagine, especially not one as small and seemingly insignificant as Eleanor Fairchild, whose survival on these mountains had already defied all expectations. She moved closer, patient and deliberate, waiting for the perfect moment when Ezra would need her most. The weight of her father's locket against her chest, a constant reminder of everything at stake in this confrontation that had been inevitable from the moment she set foot on this mountain, searching for answers that were about to find their resolution in the harsh light of dawn. The standoff shattered like ice in spring when one of Roe's men grew impatient and fired the first shot, the bullet splintering the window frame inches from where Ezra had positioned himself. The mountain air erupted with gunfire as Ezra returned fire with practiced precision, dropping the impulsive shooter with a clean shot to the shoulder that removed him from the fight without killing him outright. Roe and his remaining men scattered for cover, returning fire from behind trees and a large boulder at the edge of the clearing, the chaos providing perfect cover for Eleanor as she continued her stealthy approach toward the sentry, who remained unaware of her presence until she pressed her rifle barrel against his back and relieved him of his weapon with a whispered instruction that left no room for misinterpretation. She bound his hands with leather strips from his own pack, gagging him with his bandana before concealing him in a shallow depression beneath a snow-laden pine. The entire operation executed with such quiet efficiency that his companions remained oblivious to his absence, still focusing their attention on the cabin where Ezra maintained a steady defense. The firefight settled into a tense rhythm, neither side gaining clear advantage as the morning light strengthened, illuminating the battlefield with unforgiving clarity that made any movement increasingly dangerous. Eleanor counted her remaining ammunition with growing concern, knowing Ezra must be facing similar limitations inside the cabin where his controlled, precise shooting suggested conservation rather than confidence. She studied the slope above where Rowe and another man had taken position behind the large boulder, her eyes tracking the precarious snow buildup that hung like a frozen wave ready to crash down with minimal provocation, a natural weapon waiting to be triggered by someone who understood mountain terrain as intimately as she did from years of accompanying her father on his prospecting journeys. Shifting position carefully, Eleanor worked her way upslope, using trees for cover until she reached a vantage point above and behind the boulder where Rowe directed his assault on the cabin. She fired 2 carefully placed shots into the snowpack above them, the report echoing across the valley and momentarily drawing their confused attention before the rumbling began, soft at first, then building to a thunderous crescendo as the small avalanche she had triggered descended with unstoppable force. Rowe dove clear at the last possible second, his companion less fortunate as the cascade of snow and debris engulfed him and swept the boulder aside like a child's toy, dramatically altering the battlefield in an instant. Ezra seized the opportunity, bursting from the cabin with rifle raised as Rowe scrambled to regain his footing. But the prospector's instincts for survival were razor-sharp, and he rolled behind a fallen tree trunk before Ezra could line up a shot. The third man, seeing the odds shift dramatically against them, broke cover and fled toward the tree line only to run directly into Eleanor's path. They collided hard, both tumbling into the deep snow as they struggled for control of her rifle. Despite her smaller size, Eleanor fought with the ferocity of someone defending not just her life but justice long denied, managing to bring the rifle butt down hard against her attacker's temple, leaving him stunned long enough for her to scramble away. The momentary distraction proved costly as Rowe spotted her, recognition and rage distorting his features as he abandoned his cover to charge directly toward her with a knife drawn, clearly intending to eliminate the last Fairchild and any claim she might have to her father's discovery. Ezra's roar of warning carried across the clearing as he raced to intercept, covering ground with powerful strides that ate the distance between them. He tackled Rowe from behind, mere feet from where Eleanor struggled to bring her rifle to bear, the 2 large men crashing into the snow in a tangle of limbs and deadly intent, their struggle primitive and brutal as they fought for dominance. Eleanor circled the fighting men, searching for a clear shot that wouldn't endanger Ezra, but they moved too quickly, rolling and grappling in a lethal dance that offered no safe opportunity. The flash of steel caught her eye a heartbeat before Rowe drove his knife into Ezra's side. The mountain man's grunt of pain almost lost in the sounds of their struggle. Eleanor abandoned caution then, launching herself onto Rowe's back and locking her arm around his throat in a chokehold her father had taught her for defense against larger opponents, her size allowing her to maintain position as he tried unsuccessfully to dislodge her, his movements growing increasingly desperate as oxygen deprivation began to take effect. When he finally slumped unconscious, she maintained the hold for several seconds longer to ensure he wouldn't immediately recover, then bound him securely with rope from his own pack before turning her full attention to Ezra. Blood stained the snow beneath him in an expanding crimson pool that stood in stark contrast to the pristine white landscape. But his eyes remained clear and focused as Eleanor quickly examined the wound, relieved to find the knife had struck muscle rather than vital organs. The sun now stood fully above the mountain peaks, bathing the valley below in golden morning light that sparkled off the snow like scattered diamonds, the peaceful scene forming an incongruous backdrop to the violence that had just unfolded. The contrast wasn't lost on Eleanor, as she carefully bandaged Ezra's wound with strips torn from her petticoat, her small hands working with gentle precision that belied their recent deadly purpose. "I thought I told you to run if things went badly," Ezra murmured, his voice strained but steady, as she helped him to a sitting position against a tree trunk. Eleanor smiled faintly as she tightened the bandage, securing it with a neat knot before meeting his gaze. "I thought I made it clear I don't take orders well," she replied, reaching for the canteen to offer him water. "Besides," she added more softly, "partners don't abandon each other, not when it matters most." Ezra's hand covered hers briefly as he took the canteen, the touch conveying more than words could have about how completely their relationship had transformed in the space of a few days from reluctant shelter mates to something neither had expected to find in these unforgiving mountains where survival alone should have been miracle enough.